Hey everybody, John Wagnon here with DevCentral, and we're bringing you another Lightboard lesson video. And today we're going to talk about SSL certificates. And not just SSL certificates, but SSL certificates that maybe do some rogue stuff every now and then, and some problems that might create. And I wanted to let you know that this situation is out there and make you aware of it. So kind of the bottom line situation is that it is possible for you to own a domain name and a certificate for that domain name that someone else also has a valid certificate for. So basically someone else can have a valid certificate for your domain name, and that could create a lot of problems. So here's the situation that goes on sometimes. All right, let's say that you've got a domain name example.com, and I'll put it right here, example.com. And let's say, Bill, buys this thing at a point in time. And so he registers this thing. And then after, let's say, about 1 year, he unregisters it. And so here it's an unregister of example.com. And then it's out there for purchase or whatever. The issue, or part of the issue, is that when Bill goes to get example.com, he also goes to the certificate authority and says, I want to get a certificate for example.com. And so he gets a cert for example.com, and that certificate is good, let's say, for 3 years, which is a pretty common amount of time for a certificate to be good for a certain domain name. You don't have to do that, which, by the way, a little plug right now, maybe not a plug, but just a note, that Let's Encrypt is a certificate authority, and they have a max of like 90 days. It's an automated thing, and so they're just constantly updating the certificates, and that's, well, it could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you want to do, but for this thing, actually, it could be a good thing because there's not these long-lived certificates out there. But nonetheless, in this case, it's very common to get a certificate that's good for, let's say, 3 years. And so the certificate, when all this stuff gets registered, is here, and it's going to be good for, out here for 3 years. One of the issues with this is that when you get a certificate, one of the features of the certificate is that you can stuff other domain names inside that certificate as well. So you don't just have to have the domain name that you're talking about. You can put what's called subject alternate names. So I'll put subject alt names in these things. All right, so for this one, let's use the example.com one again. So you have a certificate for example.com. You could stuff other subject alt names in there, like, for example, let's say login.example.com, example.com. And so then that way, if you own example.com or you own login.example.com, and someone visits that login site, then you have a certificate that covers that site as well, and then they won't get these certificate problems and all that. Well, what some people do is they say, hey, I don't want to just put these other little subdomains in that. I also want to put, let's say I own test.com also, test.com. And so I'm going to stuff that in there also, because when I go buy these certificates, these things can be expensive, and so if I go buy one, I want to stuff as much stuff in there as I can to get the most bang for my buck or whatever, all right? So that's all well and good. So then that way, of course, if someone visits test.com, then that domain is covered by that certificate, even though that certificate ultimately was purchased for example.com. All right, so let's say after 1 year, Bill unregisters, but he doesn't necessarily unregister example.com. Maybe he unregisters test.com. So whereas test used to be tied in with all this stuff, now test is available. So let's pick on John, because that's my name, right? John goes in and he's like, hey man, I really want this test.com domain. That's an awesome domain. And he checks it out, and because it's been unregistered from here, he can buy it now. So he buys test.com, and he gets a certificate for test.com, and maybe it's also good for 3 years, all right? So there's his cert for test.com, and it's good, and it goes on for 3 years or whatever. All right, well, that's all well and good as well, except this certificate is still going on, because remember, this happened at like the 1 year point that John bought test.com because it was available at that point. this certificate is still good for 3 years. So there's going to be like an overlap of 2 years right here of a certificate that is established for test.com and another certificate that covers test.com. So that creates some interesting situations. One situation that it could create is if Bill goes in here and says, I do not want to revoke this certificate right here because then I got to buy a whole new certificate and then I got to load all this stuff up again. And just because I got rid of test.com, I'm not going to go through that whole process of buying a new certificate because they're expensive and all that stuff. So he does not he does not revoke this certificate. Therefore, he still has the capability to, in what would be in this case, to man-in-the-middle attack test.com, because he could put himself in between a user and then now the legitimate test.com. Someone could visit Bill's site with his certificate and they would not get a certificate warning or any problems at all because it's still covered here. So that's a problem. And so you can see an attacker, bad guy, could actually force this situation and kind of force himself in the middle there. So that's an issue. The other is also true, and that is that John over here could say, hey, I've got a valid cert for test.com. And so John could alert the certification authority or the certificate authority for this certificate over here. There's a group called the CA Browser Forum, and they handle all this stuff, all the administrative and legal and all that kind of stuff for certificates and all that, across the internet today. And they have, one of the rules that they say is if a certificate is changed in any way, if it's updated, if it's whatever, then it must be revoked within 24 hours of any kind of substantial change. Well, one of your domain names being removed is a substantial change. So legitimately what John could do is he could say, hey, certification authority, you need to revoke this certificate because it has my domain name listed in it. And that's clearly a change because I legitimately own that domain now. So if John were to do that, let's say that Bill had, example.com still rocking and rolling, doing its thing, log in. Maybe he had some other stuff in there as well. If John says revoke that certificate, it would revoke all of that stuff. And these guys actually that, I got to give credit to these couple of guys that discovered all this stuff. And I'll link to all their information. They call this situation Bygone Ssl. It's kind of a clever term to talk about like what's happening here. There's SSL certificates bygone and they're still out there and they can do bad things. They actually tested this to say, well, hey, would a certificate authority legitimately take the request from, in this case, someone like a John out there that says, hey, please revoke, and they did. They were able to say, hey, certificate authority, whatever. They did. They were willing to then revoke what would be this certificate, which would have knocked out all of these websites or would have created certificate problems for all of them, which is not good at all. So one of the questions you ask then, or you should ask is, well, how often does this kind of stuff happen? And are there really certificates with a whole bunch of subject alt names in them? There are some CDN providers out there. These guys had done all this research. They looked at it. They said they looked at some CDN providers and they found that that one particular had one certificate that had like 700 subject alt names loaded in it. So you can imagine there were all kinds of domain names listed in this thing. And they also found that some of those names listed in what would be that one like mega certificate, if you will, some of the domain names listed in there were available for purchase right now. So this exact situation could happen that someone could come in, they could buy that one domain name off of that one mega certificate, and then they would legitimately have a certificate for that one domain name, and then they could go to the certification authority and say, hey, revoke the whole thing. And then, no joke, 700 websites just like that would be down, or have massive certificate problems, which people do not want that to happen. So anyway, so this is a real problem. A couple of things you can do on this is there's this concept or this idea of certificate transparency that is available now. And there are logs that are kept. Without going into the details of certificate transparency, there are logs that are kept that you, as a certificate owner or a potential certificate owner, can go out and check the logs of the certificate transparency list and say, would my certificate potentially, or would my domain name certificate potentially have problems based on the information found in these certificate transparency logs? So that's one thing you could do as a domain owner or as a prospective domain owner. You could check to see if your domain is listed in any of those certificate transparency logs to know if you're going to step in any problems. The other thing that you could do is just be a good neighbor, as it were, in the internet out there today. And if you have a certificate here with a domain, and then you somehow find out that someone else has, that same domain, maybe before you go to revoke their certificate and completely knock them totally offline, give them a call, shoot them an email, say, hey, this situation's going on. Can we please work out a deal here? But I need to get that thing revoked off of your certificate because you could be man-in-the-middling me like crazy. And I guess you could do the reverse too. I mean, if you have something that's been revoked, then reach out and say, hey, we've got some issues here. So we can be good neighbors to each other as well. So it's good to know that this situation is out there. It's good to know that it's going on, and just to be aware that this could present a problem to you. So hopefully you've learned a couple of things. Appreciate you hanging in there with us today on this Lightboard lesson video. Hey, if you like this thing, you can click right up here on our DC ball and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you guys out there in the community.